I'm sorry, but I don't find that very real. But what about airplanes? I mean, I noticed at Earth Day where they stopped, I guess, but they used to have these big rallies in different cities attacking corporations. And I noticed that all the people who were speaking anti-corporation arrived there on airplanes. And I just wondered how they would do it without a big corporation.
Well, you know, when you live in a society, if you were living in the Soviet Union, for example, in 1970, even if you were completely against communism, you would have to make some use of the communist setup apparatus just to function in life. And if you're living in the United States today, no matter what your political principles or economic principles are, you have to make use of what's offered to you because this is all there is. Just as perhaps Mr. Novak makes use of a government health care insurance that many of you, maybe he doesn't think is ideal. And I dare say that if tomorrow a Canadian health care system was instituted, many of us would make use of it even if we didn't think it was the ideal. You have to make use of what's there. So the fact that an anti-corporate activist flies on an airplane doesn't seem to me to be particularly hypocritical. But the point I tried to make before, and perhaps I didn't stress it well enough, is that you have to separate distributism and technology, distributism and industry into two separate questions. Distributism is the idea of retiring on a nice farm. That's not what we're talking about. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. And that has its place. And that has its good. But it's much more than that. It's a way of looking at, it's a principle that can be applied to all kinds of economic activities, urban and rural both. And it is not a hankering after a 17th century or 15th century, what have you, way of life. It's a principle of ownership, a principle of distribution of property, a principle of the role of government and the role of occupational groups, which can be applied. It was applied in the Middle Ages. There are societies even today that apply it to some degree better than we do. So it's not a matter of a return to some kind of a past, whether idyllic or not.
I want to repeat, I don't think Medicare is a contradiction of democratic capitalism. It's just an expression of it.
Let me ask you, would you be in favor of a Canadian healthcare type system?
No, because it rations things, and people wait for all kinds of operations months and months and months and years.
But do they do that with Medicare?
No.
Well, why not? Well, if it works with Medicare, why wouldn't it work with the rest of the population?
You mean here?
Yeah, I mean, if the point of Medicare is you have basically a single payer for if you're over a certain age. Why couldn't you just lower that age? Say lower 10 years every decade, every 5 years, and pretty soon you get the whole population covered.
Well, wouldn't you agree? It's my turn to question you. Wouldn't you agree that if you did it that way, you would make the uses of health care a political football? Because the parties would compete with what they would do with the funds coming into the medical system, and they would tend to want to improve the hospitals. They'd set almost nothing aside for research. They'd set almost nothing aside for growth in new technologies, because that's not immediate. And the political pressures, why do so many of the inventions in health happen in a system like ours and not in government-supported systems?
Well, let me just say that I'm not, despite what I may have implied, I don't think the Canadian system is the ideal, although I do think it's acceptable. But I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought there. I think I'm done.
Thank you, Dr. Professor Storck. Now I would like to call Dr. Clark to the podium, and I would ask Tom Storck to ask a couple questions to Dr. Clark. Dr. Clark, thank you.
I agreed with almost everything you said in your critique of both capitalism and of neoclassical economics that you made earlier. But I was a little puzzled because you were billed here as the representative for democratic socialism. You didn't say a whole lot about socialism in your presentation. Many of the things you said could be broadly associated with social democratic parties in Europe, which operate in an essentially capitalist framework. Now, given the criticism that the church has made, especially in Quadragesimo Anno, about socialism, about any intellectual tradition which labels itself as socialism, and you could find many, many examples. I use the Spanish government as one. I've even have, you can find some in this country too, of socialist thinkers. Why would you recommend socialism as an option for Catholics when it's been associated, as you admitted yourself, with a materialistic philosophy?
Well, it's interesting that we've spent a lot of time agreeing. And there are a few things that I hold that I will not challenge. The creed, and that my family loves me. Everything else has to be based on evidence. And evidence that is continually re-examined. The slides that I didn't go to looked at the market failures and how they necessarily require government intervention. Now, I do not believe in socialism as a good in and of itself, but I do believe that the role of the state or the role of social action, social control over different aspects of the economy as a player in the economy is often necessary. And if you want to solve problems like unemployment in our economy, then there has to be some sort of active role in the government in addressing that. If you want to solve the problem of giving everyone health care, then there's going to be some sort of way that we socialize part of it, we make health care a right, and we adjust accordingly. That could mean having a national health insurance where we all belong to the same and have private providers or independent providers. It could be complete nationalization where everyone who's a doctor or nurse is working for the state. There's a whole variety of ways that you could do that, but I think the point that was made before on Medicare, if we can do that as a right for people over 65 who are really expensive to take care of, then we can certainly do it as a right for everyone else who are a lot less expensive to take care of. And the question in terms of research and development and those things, I mean, the government is funding much of the research and development. The universities are carrying out much of the research and development. We just privatize the benefits. And when we use only a market signal, I'm not saying all market signals are bad or that the market signal is bad, but if we only use a market measure as to where we direct our health care, we're rationing it. We ration it right now. We ration it to those who have good insurance, who have money. We ration what drugs we develop to those that are profitable developed, which is why we put so much time in trying to cure baldness and drugs like Viagra and stuff like that, instead of dealing with diseases like ALS that only a small number of people, and then the people who are dealing with, so we realize the market isn't enough, so we do direct it and do have state intervention or some sort of intervention. But again, I would not argue that the government national should take over all these functions just as a good in and of itself. I fully believe in the principle of subsidiarity, and we need to do things at the lowest level possible. I agree that most business should be done at a local level. The arguments for airplanes and corporations are necessary. In economics, we base that on economies of scale. But if you look at the actual evidence of economies of scale and how much concentration or how big a firm that they support, there are only a handful of industries that justify having a few corporate players. Airlines is one of them, but they're heavily subsidized by the government. They're not private companies out on their own. They're heavily subsidized by the military, which is a huge subsidy, the military budget for large corporations. But outside of a few handful of companies, there really isn't a reason to have McDonald's to serve 1 billion hamburgers. You can have lots of small ones. The economic argument is not there for concentration. So I wouldn't look at socialism, or I'd worry about anyone who's pushing having government provide services as a good in and of itself. But sometimes it has to be at the level of the government. Sometimes it should be at the level of a local government. That's often preferable. Sometimes guilds and cooperatives would be preferable, but they would require a great deal of government support and setting up the rules to allow them to exist, to allow them so that they wouldn't be squeezed out of the economy, which is what they would be done now under the current system. But as an ideal, I mean, I'm an economist who tries to solve problems. I'm not someone who's going to promote another ism besides Catholicism.